In recent days, signs of a possible meeting between Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump have raised one big question. What exactly Putin wants to end the war? This reunion isn't just another diplomatic move for Putin. This could be the moment to secure, through direct negotiation, what the battlefield has so far failed to deliver. And for Trump, the stakes are just as high. Failing to bring this war to an end would not only damage his credibility internally in the United States, but also signal a weakening of Washington's global influence at a time when American leadership is being tested. What's truly at stake in this meeting goes far beyond Ukraine. From the very beginning of the war, Vladimir Putin has insisted that Russia's objective goes beyond the battlefield. For him, Ukraine is not just another former Soviet republic. It is the core of what he sees as Russia's strategic and historical frontier. In Putin's worldview, allowing Ukraine to become fully integrated into NATO or the European Union would mean placing Western military and political influence directly on Russia's doorstep, something he views as intolerable. Since 2014, when protests in Kiev overthrew a pro-Russian government and set Ukraine on a path toward the West, the Kremlin has worked actively to reverse that trajectory. The invasion in 2022 marked a turning point. While Russia initially sought rapid military gains, it became evident over time that full territorial conquest was unrealistic without enormous costs. As the war dragged on, what emerged was a broader strategic goal: to force a political reconfiguration in Kyiv that would guarantee Ukraine's long-term neutrality. This doesn't necessarily require full military occupation. What the Kremlin wants is a Ukraine that is permanently non-aligned, a country that does not host NATO troops, does not receive Western weapons, and does not challenge Russian influence in the region. To achieve that, Russia has maintained control over parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, using these areas not only as strategic depth, but as leverage in future negotiations. And behind the scenes, Russian diplomacy has repeatedly signaled that territorial concessions could be on the table, but only if the West agrees to reshape Ukraine's geopolitical identity. For Putin, that is the real endgame. Not just land, but influence. Not just ceasefire, but control over Ukraine's orientation for decades to come. And now, with the political climate shifting and Trump back in the White House, the Kremlin sees a rare opportunity to turn that vision into reality. Since the beginning of the conflict, the United States has positioned itself as Ukraine's most powerful ally, supplying weapons, intelligence, and financial support. But under President Donald Trump, Washington's strategy has taken a new, more urgent direction. While Trump initially avoided direct confrontation with Vladimir Putin, those days are over. The repeated failure of diplomatic contacts, often followed by renewed Russian strikes, has severely tested Trump's patience. In public statements, he has expressed deep frustration, calling Russia's actions in Ukraine disgusting and horrifying, and accusing Putin of repeatedly breaking verbal agreements. In early July, Trump issued a clear ultimatum to Moscow: present a serious ceasefire proposal within 50 days or face consequences. Days later, after Russian officials, particularly Dmitry Medvedev, ridiculed the ultimatum, Trump reduced the deadline to just 10 days. The tone shifted dramatically. To underline the seriousness of his warning, Trump publicly confirmed the deployment of 2 U.S. nuclear-armed submarines to appropriate areas, believed to be strategic locations near Russia. In a social media post, he warned Medvedev to watch his words and emphasized U.S. military superiority, stating that America has the best submarines in the world. This escalation reflects more than just personal frustration. With the midterm elections approaching, Trump is under growing pressure to show results, especially from voters and lawmakers who expect him to end the war quickly on U.S. terms. The credibility of his administration, and by extension in the global authority of Washington, is increasingly tied to how and when this war ends. If Trump fails to deliver peace or appears to be manipulated by Putin, it could be seen as a sign of declining American influence in the international system. That's a narrative Trump is determined to avoid. Even though both leaders could benefit with the end of the war, one issue remains unresolved, and it could decide the future of any negotiation: the fate of the territories Russia claims to have annexed but still struggles to control. Defending the rights of these populations, including language, cultural identity, and local autonomy, has been one of the central narratives in the Russian rationale since the conflict began in 2014. Russian officials argue that these communities have been marginalized by Ukrainian policies aimed at national integration, and that their protection requires a permanent political solution. For Russia, any durable settlement must acknowledge the unique status of these regions, whether through recognition, autonomy, or federalization. For the West, particularly the United States, accepting territorial changes brought by force would set a precedent difficult to justify in broader geopolitical terms. Yet these regions also represent an opportunity for negotiation. Given their mixed control and complex demographic makeup, some analysts believe they could serve serve as a foundation for compromise, where formal recognition is avoided, but certain political guarantees are granted. In that sense, the territories function as more than just front lines of a war. They are also symbols of the competing visions for Ukraine's future, and how these regions are addressed in any agreement will shape not only the end of this conflict, but the long-term security architecture of Eastern Europe. In any direct negotiations between Washington and Moscow, a lasting agreement would require more than a ceasefire. It would demand strategic concessions on both sides. The war in Ukraine is part of a broader geopolitical contest, and any deal would likely include terms that go well beyond Ukraine's borders. For the U.S., the priority would be to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty, even within a neutral framework. That could involve guarantees against Russian interference in Ukraine's politics and limits on support for separatist groups. Washington may also push for international monitoring through the UN or OSCE to oversee ceasefire terms, troop withdrawals, and minority protections. Another key goal would be limiting Russia's military reach near NATO borders, especially in Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. Moscow, in turn, would likely demand formal recognition of Ukraine's permanent neutrality and a ban on future NATO membership. It could also seek restrictions on Western arms deliveries and a phased withdrawal of foreign military personnel. Diplomatically, Russia may push for tacit recognition of its influence in parts of the post-Soviet region, including non-interference in Belarus, Moldova, and Georgia. Also, sanctions relief, especially in energy, finance, and tech, would also be high on the list. Kyiv's role in these talks would remain critical, but much of the outcome would hinge on the leverage and limits of its Western backers. Despite deep differences, both sides might settle for controlled ambiguity, leaving some issues unresolved to allow each to claim political victory at home. The real challenge will be building a stable framework, one that stops the fighting without legitimizing force as a tool to redraw borders. If you found this analysis useful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more fact-based coverage of global conflicts and geopolitical developments. Thank you for watching.